Our next presentation, we have Jinwen Xu on spatiotemporal flood exposure changes.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jinwen from University of South Florida, and I'm a PhD candidate. Today, I will introduce my research on spatiotemporal flood exposure change in the contiguous United States from 2001 to 2019. So let's get started. Here's the outline. My presentation will include introduction, data and methods, results, summary, and future directions. So here, first, I want to introduce some basic concepts of floods here, such as the flood hazard, flood exposure, and vulnerability. Flood risk is a function of the flood hazard, flood exposure, and vulnerability. And when assessing the vulnerability and flood exposure, it is very important to consider the local, social, and economic conditions, while they're actually dependent. They're actually dependent on the economic, social, geographic, demographic, or cultural conditions. And another thing needs to address when assessing the flood exposure is the environmental justice. So here is a paragraph cited from the United States Department of Justice that any of us can be exposed to the flood hazard in this case. And some of the communities, like the community of color, low-income communities, or tribal communities, these communities may suffer more or bear these hardships disproportionately. So they are less likely to receive the services or supports needed to address these harms. So it is very important to consider these communities when assessing the flood exposure. And previous studies have already showed that the flood exposure is higher for socially vulnerable populations, especially for the inland floods. And vulnerable population groups often inhabit in flood-prone areas due to the societal barriers or related to the social stratifications in the United States. And some index approaches already measured and perfectly modeled the social vulnerability, but there is still a gap in such studies because they haven't got the long-term trend of the flood exposure. And of course, in some studies, environmental justice issue was not mentioned. So this study, we aimed to study the spatial temporal change of flood exposure during the past two decades, or specifically the past 18 years. And we want to analyze the unbalanced urban development in flood zones. And we want to know what is the driving factor or driving socioeconomic factor of such uncommon urban developments in flood zones. And finally, want to address the environmental justice issue. And here's our research questions. So first, we want to know how responsive are local communities to flood hazards, and how is this responsiveness related to social economic conditions? And then we want to know what is the temporal change in urban flood exposure from 2001 to 2019, and how this change are related to social economic conditions. And finally, we want to know within the flood zone and outside the flood zone, what are the social economic disparities between those populations, and have this disparity changed among the past 2 decades? So let me introduce our data and methods. To address the first research question, how responsive are local communities? We developed the index here. So the UI means the ratio of urban areas in flood zones to the total urban areas within the research unit. So if the UI is high, that means the urban area in flood zones ratio is high. And LI means the area of flood zones divided by the area of total length within that research unit. So we compare the UI with LI. If the UI is larger than LI, that means there are more urban developments happening in flood zones compared with the baseline. So if the UI is less than LI, that means this community have less urban developments in flood zones and can be considered as responsive, since the people outside the flood zones when suffering from the disasters, can help those within the flood zones. So we developed the index called the DI, which is a difference between the UI and LI. If the DI is less than 0, that means the community is considered as responsive, while the DI is larger than 0, we consider this community might not be responsive to flood hazard. And to address our second question, derived from our last index, we we developed the delta D, which subtracts the previous year from the current year and calculates this difference. And we use this number. To represent the spatial temporal change in the responsiveness. And when we go to our last research question, what are the social economic disparities between people living in and outside the flood zone? We use this equation, which the left side means the disadvantaged population living within the flood zone, while the right one means the ratio of disadvantaged population living outside the flood zone to the total population living outside the flood zone. So if this number is less than 0, that means the left part is less than the right part. That means that there are more people living outside the flood zone, or more disadvantaged population living outside the flood zone. If this number is larger than 0, that means the disadvantaged population, or the concentration of the disadvantaged population, is within the flood zone. So this needs to be paid attention. So our data sources are from the MRLC, land use and land cover data, and the FEMA National Flood Hazard Layer. And to the left is, oops, I always mistake, sorry for that. To the left is the 100-year flood map, and to the right we did a zonal statistics to calculate the coverage of these flood maps, and we use all of the counties that has a larger than 5% flood map coverage as our research area. And these are the community survey data we used. We consider all these different socioeconomic variables from these years. And due to the data limits, there are some years are blank, such as the unemployed population in the 2008 and the disabled and non-working labor forces in 2008 and 2011. So also the data in 2001 is derived from the US Census data in 2000 because there are no data available before 2009. And the 2009 data was used to represent the condition in 2008. So here are two discrepancies. And let's see some results here. So first, to the left is the trend of this community responsiveness index. And overall, we can see that this number is negative, which means that the whole United States responsiveness to disasters is generally good, and it's becoming better because it's decreasing. And to the right, you can see it's an animation, and it's changing from it shows the number of D from 2001 to 2019. And we slightly see some counties become red and some counties become blue. So generally, it doesn't change that much. So the flood exposure or the community responsiveness in the United States has not changed that much during the past 2 decades. This is our first finding, and here we also compared the top 10 largest or the smallest D, and we can see that compare the left side with the right side, the counties remain the same. Some counties, like the Chambers County here, it changed positions, but most of the counties remain the same. So we still hold that statement. And we also, we later correlate those responsiveness index with the socioeconomic variables listed here in the 2001, 2008, and 2009 till 2019. And we found that communities with a high percentage of African American or kids or female-headed households, or percentage of people over 25 years old with no high school diploma, these communities, they tend to have a good responsiveness. Since here is a negative correlation, that means the higher this number is, the lower D is, and we just illustrate that the lower D it can be interpreted as a good responsiveness. While it is worth to pay attention that the elderly and the percentage of households lacking complete plumbing facilities and higher the median value of owner-occupied housing units are, and these communities face a more flood exposure. So this is our first finding. And we compared the D responsiveness between each air interval. Due to the time limit, I won't introduce these specifically, but I will introduce this one, the delta D, from the beginning and the end from the 2001 and 2019. And here the map shows the delta D. And we found that the most, or in other words, the urban developments in flood zones during the past 2 decades, the most one occurred in Miami-Dade County, which is here. That we know that Miami, in Florida, there are a lot of environmental friendly buildings or environmental friendly constructions are built near shorelines. However, they say it's environmental friendly, but when facing with the hurricanes such as the Hurricane Ian just occurred 1 month ago, and they suffered a great loss or economic loss from this shoreline, from this shorefront properties. So these environmental friendly constructions is questionable as they face a great flood exposure. And here below are the counties that trying to limit their developments within the flood zones. So these are the trends between 2001 and 2019. And here is a correlation between the delta D with the socioeconomic variables. And here we can see that the renter still shows a positive correlation with the delta D, which means that the higher ratio the renters are in a community, then it will have increased trend of this D, which means the less responsiveness. So this needs to be paid attention. While the Hispanic mobile home and the household lacking complete plumbing services, if they are having a decreased trend of this flood exposure, which is good. And here I also do a bivariate map of delta D and D, which we can view this D as the velocity and view this delta D as the acceleration. So to the left top side, actually the right side are generated from the left side, and to the top side is the low, which means that these communities has less lands developed in the flood zone areas, and these areas are restricting those lands developed in flood zone areas, which is considered as sustainable and good. And while these communities, the purple ones, they're actually having some high percentage of lands developed in flood zones, and we can see that their trends of developing lands in flood zones are increasing. So these are different scenarios. While here low-high means low, well, it means that it has a low percentage of area in the flood zones, but it's increased its developments in flood zones. While this high-low means that it's already have a high percentage of flood zones, and they're restricting the developments within the flood zones. Okay. And finally, before I go to the last result, here is the social economic disparity. I want to refresh this equation. To the left is the disadvantaged population ratio within the flood zone, while to the right is the disadvantaged population ratio outside the flood zone. And we did the t-test to see if this number is less than 0 or larger than 0. And if it's significantly less than 0, that means that this type of population tends to reside outside the flood zone because because this number is less than 0, and we'll see some examples here. So to the left side is all these 10 variables that we analyzed, and we made the bar plot of it. To the in red is the 2001, and to the right the blue ones are 2019. And here are the results of this t-test. That the negative sign means it's below 0, and positive sign means it's larger than 0. And larger than 0 means that this type of population is more likely to reside within the flood zones. And here are the comparison between the 2001 and 2019. And we also calculate the delta dis, which shows you the trends of this preference to live in the flood zones or not. And this is an example of kids that it shows that kids are likely to reside outside the flood zones, while this trend is not clear. And another example is the elderly. The elderly is more likely to reside in flood zones, and the trend remains in 2019, while this change is decreasing, or their preference is decreased. And another example is the renter. Here we can see that the renter is more likely to reside within the flood zone, and in 2001 and 2019, while this trend is increasing. Okay, here are some summary of our study. So first, the overall trend of the flood exposure in the continuous analysis is slightly decreased, meaning the responsiveness increased, but the local trend varies. And there are some the communities with good responsiveness to flood hazard have certain socio-economic characters, which I have mentioned above. And there are some certain social demographics were detected in communities with decreasing responsiveness to flood hazard over the past few decades. And in 2019, a majority of disadvantaged population groups analyzed were likely to reside within the flood zones. Just as we see that there's a long list of red sign. And finally, the change of disadvantaged population residing in flood zone vary among population groups. And here's a summary. Our study developed the indices to analyze this long-term trend of community responsiveness. And and social economic variables from the community survey were used to explain the latest flood exposure and this long-term change. And yeah, here are some summaries. And due to the time limit, I will go it very quickly. And here are some our future directions. We will validate our results with the real flood events and damage data, and we want to include more social economic variables such as the blind or low vision population, or etc. And want to build a comprehensive index for environmental justice towards the flood exposure. And we want to address the unbalanced development in the marginalized and disadvantaged population groups. And here are our reference and acknowledgements. And thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you for the interesting project and very good presentation, clear presentation. I particularly appreciate the focus of the study on vulnerable population. Really match the theme of the conference really well. I have a quick question about the calculation. So you have the D on a yearly basis, right? You calculate that on a yearly basis.
Yes.
So the population, what is the source data, population source data? Is it AMS or?
In 2001, we use the US Census Survey data, but in the other years, we use the American Community Survey 5-year estimate.
Oh, ACS, I'm sorry, yeah,
Yes.
American Community Survey. Yeah, so that will be, I assume you use that, but it's usually kind of 3-year average or it's estimate, and it's not really the data, the ACS data that you have is not particularly for the flooding area, FEMA area, so you have to interpolate.
Yes,
right?
Yes, we overlaid the flood zone area with the developed lands area.
Okay, yeah, assume you did that. I was just wondering, with all those processes, have you ever thought about it? Have you given any thoughts about the accuracy of the estimation and how this might impact your findings? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Dr. Yao. Yeah, actually, the accuracy is a question, is an issue in our study. Since we only consider the urban areas, we assume that population are concentrated in urban areas. So when we do the simulation, we mostly focus on the urban areas, while the density could be an issue, and we may include the density in our simulation in the future, and maybe we process this and see if there's any differences. And that is a good question, and we will address that. Thank you.
Hi, I have a comment and question that relate to each other. So this is really great and really interesting, and love seeing this research is intended to help people get support. I wanted to say that for the areas that have great community support, that also are marginalized communities, often historically because of systemic issues, those areas don't have support, obviously, including like federal funding, and that's why there's so much community support. And obviously, people would still like to have more external support and not have to constantly be exhausted. And I think a great example is Hurricane Katrina hitting Louisiana, and they're still working on building up a lot of stuff and still trying to figure out how to stop flooding issues. So I was curious if you've thought about looking at federal and state level funding for disaster response as well as any temporal factors, because I think that'd be a really interesting social justice and equity viewpoint that this research definitely will help to highlight.
Yes, thank you for your comments. Yeah, we will include the federal funding as our variable in our future study, since the change in the federal funding can also influence the developments in the urban areas, especially in the flood zone areas. Yeah, thank you for that suggestion.
In the last couple of years, the flood zone maps have changed. And so is that another parameter that you might look at how this has affect or how it will affect these results with the changing of where the flood zones are and, you know, the increase or decrease of vulnerable populations in those zones?
Oh, yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, that's a great question. And I was wondering that as well. However, here we use the 100-year flood map. So that means that this flood, we assume that it happened once 100 year. So it's an assumption, and you know, the climate change, the climate changes, and the extreme weather events happening more and more. So yeah, there's a potential that these flood zone maps needs to be revised, and we may include the flood map. Actually, honestly speaking, there is not much change in the 100-year flood map. So we have analyzed that and compared the data we accessed in 2016 with the data we accessed at 2018, and we didn't find any large discrepancies. So we still use the 100 map here, flood map here, as our resource. So I hope that answers your question, and we will keep an eye on the flood map updates in the future. Thank you for that suggestion. Thank you.